Today, let's make really classic socks on the mid-gauge machine. This pattern will also work on a bulky machine. I know many mid-gauge knitters only have hobby machines, so that's a single bed, and I've done quite a few patterns for those. But this time, we're going to use a double bed. Mine is an artisan with a river because my artisan came that way. This will also work on the silver reed mid-gauge with river. These socks have a seam up the ribbing only. The remainder of the foot is knitted as a tube, so we need to know tubular settings on the machine. On the artisan river, if these slide buttons are set to 1, the machine will knit going the direction that the button is on the side of that side of the carriage. If it's set to 0, it will not knit. We make use of this setting for tubular. The direction we want it to knit, we push to 1, and the one we want it to slip, we push to 0. I suggest thinking of it this way: down knits, up slips, and that is because the same thing is true on the main bed using these side levers. 1 or down knits, 2 or up slips. Use a number 4 yarn that's soft and on the light end of the number 4 spectrum. This is an 8-ply wool nylon blend made for heavy socks. And if you were to compare it to Red Heart Super Saver, this is thinner. For the main part of the sock, use a stitch size that gets 5 stitches 7 rows per inch. On my artisan, that is stitch size 10, which makes the knitting a little challenging, but it will do the job and it makes great socks. On the silver reed mid-gauge, you will use a smaller stitch size because the dials are not arranged the same on the two machines. I'm going to try something new here and try to include all ladies' sizes in this quite simple pattern. So for sizes 5 to 7, you'll cast on 40. For 8 to 10, you'll cast on 44. The written pattern for these will eventually appear in Country Knitting of Maine News and Views magazine, probably later in 2021. Because we are working with relatively heavy yarn for the machine, I recommend beginning in waste yarn, getting things set up for ribbing, and then knitting in a row of ravel cord. That's my blue. You don't have to do this, but it will make things easier. Then with both beds set to knit at a very small stitch size, knit the zigzag row right to left, set for tubular knitting, increase stitch size a bit, knit to the right, knit to the left. When I knitted to the right, the front bed knitted. When I knitted to the left, the back bed knitted. Now change to both beds knitting and the ribbing stitch size. I used 7/7 on the artisan and it came out very nice. To get a 6-inch ribbed sock top, such as on the sample, beginning with your knitting to the right ribbing row, knit 43 total ribbing rows. Now transfer all of the back bed stitches to the front bed. Quick discussion of stitch sizes. No matter what your manual says or what I say, every machine is a little bit unique, so you must do some swatching and experiment and find out for your zigzag row, for your tubular rows, and for your ribbing rows, what is going to be the ideal stitch size on the dial for you. Now with everything on the front bed, we want to knit 2 plain stockinette rows. This is a little bit challenging for the machine because these rows are on the river, so I'm bringing all my needles forward to knit back from hold, which makes things easier anytime there's a challenge, and knitting those 2 rows at the main stitch size for the foot, for the stockinette. Remove the ribber comb and put something heavy in the middle of the work. I like the heavy forks from my Cool Tools and Cheap Tricks book. We want a weight there to hold the center stitches down because we're going to take the 10 or 11 stitches at each side, 10 for size 5 to 7, 11 for size 8 to 10, and lift them off onto another tool. This can be a multi-prong tool if you have one with enough prongs. It can be waste yarn, or it can be a circular knitting needle, which is what I'm using. We're going to lift 1/4 of the total stitches from each end, rotate them around, and hang them on the main bed. This is one of the finickiest parts and easiest to mess up of the whole sock, So just resolve to take your time. Don't do it until there's good light in the knitting room, and take a break after moving the first batch of stitches if you need to. With the stitches safely held on the tool, fold the fabric so that the stitches can go back in the same order on the back or main bed, and rehang them on the first 10 or 11 needles. Make a real effort not to twist any stitches. The easiest tool for that is going to be a prong tool, but you can learn to see them no matter what you're using. The hardest tool to see it on is this knitting needle, but I'm really not having any trouble. You can just get familiar with it. Lower the ribber bed as far as you possibly can to do this, so you have plenty of room to work and visibility. Double check that everything is really hung securely, and then just pull the circular needle out. That part is amazingly easy. On the right side, we have the working yarn. You have the choice of taking it out of the carriage and undoing the last 10 or 11 stitches, whichever is a quarter for you, and leaving the yarn hanging so that you can rethread it in the carriage, or doing what I'm doing, going ahead and snipping it. We will have one extra yarn tail to weave in, but it's a little bit easier to work with. Either thing works. Then we do the same thing with the right 10 or 11 stitches as we did on the left, and close the beds back up. At this point, the weights become very important. You can either hang your ribber comb back in the waste yarn by pushing it through, or if you have enough other heavy weights, hang them on the fabric. Make sure both layers are weighted. Tubular settings, stockinette stitch size, knit 2 passes. This is something of a challenge for the artisan for the first row because of this heavy yarn. So again, I'm helping the carriage by letting it knit back from hold. Set the ribber bed to slip both directions. After the next pass on the main bed, wrap the working yarn around the end needle on the ribber. Now we're going to start short rowing with automatic short rows. So bring the end needle on the back bed forward into hold. Knit across, wrap the end needle on the front bed, place the end needle on the main bed and hold. That's all the wrapping, but now we're going to go back and forth, placing the last needle that knitted into hold every row until when you place the final needle in hold, there are only 6 stitches still in work for size 5 to 7 or 8 for size 8 to 10. Watch the stitches carefully, especially those that are right next to the held needles. Frequently, very frequently, move your weights and use multiple weights so that in that area, the stitches are properly pulled down. Otherwise, the pocket of knitting that's forming will loosen the stitches on the needles and they'll pop off. Attention to this detail. Frequent moving of weights is the trick to successful short rowing. Also, if you are adequately attentive, you will notice the minute a stitch doesn't completely knit off before it gets dropped. You can see that the yarn didn't quite go into the hook and pull back. And that's something you can fix by hand if you've been paying attention. And then it's a signal you need to move your weights more often or you need more of them. I now have 8 stitches left. And for the size I'm making, I only need 6, so 2 more short rows. What we've just done is called short rowing in. Now we're going to short row out. Before knitting the next row, push one needle on the side away from the carriage back to upper working position so it will resume knitting. And we'll do that all the way out. That's called short rowing out, until every needle has knitted once. Then the heel will be finished and you can heave a huge sigh of relief. But don't rush the short rowing out process. It also requires that the weights be moved frequently to keep all of the stitches pulling down enough on the needles that we don't risk losing any. Every time you see a bump, I'm reaching underneath and pulling down the fabric manually just to be safe. Last trip to the left. Wrap the end needle on the ribber bed again. The last needle's going into work on the right. We'll knit the final short row and then change the carriages back to tubular settings. I have it set so the first tubular row will knit on the riverbed, so I do not need to wrap the end needle on the river. We will knit tubular all the way down the length of the sock for sizes 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. That is 64, 6, 70, 74, 78, and 80 rows. If that sounds like a lot of rows, it's because every one counted on the counter is really half a row. Also, you may tweak your row count to perfection, but it must be an even number. If short rowing is your thing, you may simply repeat the heel to shape the toe, but I am going to show you a decreased toe, which comes out just the same shape and finishes very nicely too. Knit 4 passes with the carriage, then decrease 1 on each side of each bed and repeat down to the same number as the shortest short row. It is okay to use the full fashion decrease if you like it and it produces a nice effect, but the simple decrease also produces a nice effect, and that is what is on the toe I showed you at the beginning of this toe section. If you made a short rowed heel as you did the toe, once it's complete, scrap off in tubular knitting so as to allow yourself to Kitchener stitch the toe closed and then remove the waste yarn. After making the final decrease, so there should be 6 or 8 stitches on each bed, knit 4 passes with the carriage, so we knit on the newly decreased width. And after that, you have 2 options. If you Kitchener stitch comfortably, scrap off and Kitchener stitch the very end of the toe together. If you don't like Kitchenering, there is another option that is highly non-traditional but actually works really well. After those final 4 rows, transfer all the river stitches to the main bed and bind off neatly. This bind off will be visible to you when you wear the socks. Nobody else will know because it's inside your shoes, and I have not found it to be uncomfortable at all. So it's something to give a try if the idea of Kitchenering gives you chills. Here I'm using a hand-manipulated transfer bind-off, which creates a little chain stitch. I'm using it by hand, though I would normally use a tool because you can see better what's happening. Now there is very little finishing to accomplish. We need to pull out the waste yarn. Do that by removing the ravel cord. Mine is not true ravel cord. It is some very old odds and ends of cotton yarn. So I have to take it out in pieces. It won't pull out smoothly. Even so, it does the job I had in mind, which is to protect the tubular cast-on edge so that it wasn't stressed by the comb, and it turns out quite attractive. That's one of the several reasons for beginning in waste yarn. Here's how the automatic wrap turns out on the heel. Quite nice looking, and using heavy yarn at the top of the range of the machine, there is no problem with an appearance of holes. Now we just need to seam the back edge together and weave in a couple of tails. As you can see, the short rowed heel and the decreased toe are exactly the same shape. It looks like this is going to fit, so let's finish it. The seam will run up the center back of the ribbing only, and you may use any kind of seam that suits you. Here's one that works well and hides well. Running down the edge of the piece of ribbing, there will appear to be a column of chain stitches on each end. If you work under the bars that separate the rows of chain stitches, alternating to and fro from piece to piece, it makes a pretty nice seam. So wear your socks in good health and look forward to the written pattern in Country Knitting of Maine News and Views.